Did you know that China went to war with Sparrows and lost? Okay, so they didn't completely lose, it was more like a tie, but they still went to war with Sparrows, and we're gonna find out why in this video. But before we get going, remember to like and subscribe, especially go follow me on TikTok and check out my website, mrstockford.com. There I've been posting not just historical articles on which these videos are based, but also lesson plans and materials for free. So if you are an educator or know an educator, particularly history or social studies, these are geared for grades 6 through 12 and can be easily adapted to most age groups. And once again, they are free. They always will be free because I don't believe finances should be an obstacle in education. Now this is part 3 in a series on communism. We've already touched on the beginnings of communism as theorized by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, as laid out in the Communist Manifesto right behind me there. We have also talked about the Soviet Union's formation and the early days under Lenin and a bit under Stalin, as well as comparing it to George Orwell's Animal Farm in part 2, which brings us to China under Chairman Mao, especially the early years. Now this video is going to particularly cover Mao's rise to power all the way up to the Cultural Revolution. We're not going to cover the Cultural Revolution in this video because that is a very big topic that deserves its own video in its entirety if I'm going to do it justice. However, because the history of communism is so depressing, I'm gonna need to take a break after this video because I don't want to feel the big sad every day. Alright, so jumping right into it. Like most communist countries in history, Maoist China has its roots in revolution and civil war. The Chinese Communist Party was started in 1921 and gained a lot of traction very quickly amongst urban factory workers. They quickly joined forces with the Nationalist Party, which is also called the Kuomintang. And I'm going to take a second to pause here and preface that I do not speak any Chinese language and I am going to be butchering all of these names throughout this video. Together, their goal was to put a stop to the warlords in rural China who pretty much owned and ran everything, and to unify China under a single government. We call this alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang the First United Front. Now, anybody who knows pretty much anything about communists and nationalists can tell you those two groups don't really get along together, and so this First United Front was, at best, really shaky. In fact, Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Kuomintang, decided to join forces with the communists only under the expectation that the communists would follow nationalist protocol and expectations, which they kind of did, but mostly didn't. And so by the start of something called the Northern Expedition in 1926, the Kuomintang had already purged all of the communists from this group, shattering the alliance. Now, Sun Yat-sen died from cancer in 1925, but his cause and the Kuomintang army lived on, largely led by a man called Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek formed the National Revolution Army shortly after the death of Sun Yat-sen, and on April 12, 1927, purged all the communists and communist sympathizers from Shanghai in what we now call the Shanghai Massacre. In this massacre, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 people were killed. The next 20 years saw many outbursts of violence between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, eventually bursting into what we now call the Chinese Civil War, which lasted from 1945 to 1949. The Chinese Civil War resulted in a communist victory, and Chiang Kai-shek and the rest of his army and followers were purged from China, and they fled to Taiwan. To this day, Taiwan claims to be the actual true government of China, while the Chinese Communist Party claims to own and control Taiwan based on the result of the Civil War. And this is the reason why calling Taiwan an independent country, or recognizing it as such, is an extremely touchy issue and is in the news today with Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan. With no more nationalists to stand in their way, the Chinese Communist Party put their chairman, Mao Zedong, in power. He declared at Tiananmen Square, try saying that 3 times fast, that the country would be called the People's Republic of China, and he assumed power on October 1st, 1949. And he would maintain control in one form or another until his death in 1976. The problem was that neither Mao nor many of the other communists really knew how to run an entire country under this new communist system. But lucky for them, they had a neighbor to the north who had been doing this for several decades already. So Chairman Mao spent much of the 1949 through 1950 winter season up in Moscow, where he learned from Stalin himself, as well as his advisors, on how he should run his country and lead towards this sort of communist society. More important, however, the two countries at this time signed a treaty in which the USSR agreed to help China recover from its civil war, and both parties mutually agreed to help each other further their political and economic causes. This treaty became particularly important with the advent of the United States' involvement in the Korean War. In retaliation for the United States helping the capitalist, what would now become South Korea, the Chinese sent hundreds of thousands of troops into what we would call now North Korea, run by communists. During this war, 180,000 Chinese soldiers died. And because the United States placed a trade embargo on China as a result of the war, China's only remaining option for trade was the Soviet Union. And so over the next couple of decades, those two countries became extremely closely tied to one another. I'm going to give you forewarning, this is where the video really is going to start getting depressing and rather gruesome. As we discussed in a previous video, one of communism's main goals is to eradicate inequality. In communist China, one of the largest sources of inequality had to do with land ownership, and so Chairman Mao and his Communist Party set out a ton of policies that would try and eradicate this inequality through land ownership reforms. Now, at first glance, that doesn't sound too bad. I mean, the overall goal was to raise people out of poverty, and to their slight credit, this goal was mostly accomplished. Mostly. You see, the people of rural China were still poor at the end of all of these policies, just slightly less so. Now, in the process, according to a 1976 estimate by the United States government, around 1 million landowners were killed, their land seized, and then turned over to the peasantry. And another 800,000 people were killed during counter-revolutions. Now, this is where we need to take a pause and ask ourselves a couple of questions about these numbers. Because the United States government has had such a long history with hating communism, trying to stop it in its tracks, it stands to reason that these numbers might be overblown or exaggerated. In fact, doing so would serve the political goals of the United States by establishing the idea of capitalism good, communism bad. At the same time, though, we can't quite trust communist data because they're not going to say that they killed very many people at all, and that the people they did kill really deserved it. And so as we go through a lot of these numbers, you're going to notice that there's quite a wide range, and that's about as good as we can do with some of them. I don't think anybody on the planet knows or ever will know the exact number of people who died as a result of Mao's policies in these early years. But at least we can have a general idea. Spoiler alert, that general idea is really sad. That being said, we can probably trust the estimates from the US government in this particular case. Because shortly after squashing these counter-revolutions, Mao himself announced that the Chinese government had killed more than 700,000 counter-revolutionaries just from 1950 to 1952. In fact, Mao's government implemented a policy where every single village had to round up at least one landowner and have them publicly humiliated and then publicly executed. The more you could round up and do this to, the better. And so keeping in mind the vast number of villages there are out in rural China's territory, the orders to round up and publicly execute at least one, preferably several people, resulted in millions of deaths. In fact, the estimates range from 2 to 5 million people killed just from these public executions from this one policy. Now, in addition to these public executions, anywhere from 1.5 million to 6 million people were taken to Laogai, also known as reform through labor camps. Not just labor camps, reform through labor camps. The idea being you would come out a now loyal communist. That being said, many perished at the Laogai. Now, it's easy to say, oh, well, that wasn't Chairman Mao, that was just the party, he didn't necessarily sign off on everything. And to that, I would say, no, sir. Mao was personally involved in all of these policies. In fact, he even set execution quotas, which we should note were often exceeded. And we know he was personally involved in the organization and creation of policies that called for the mass murder of his own people because he publicly defended these policies and these murders, calling them necessary for the Communist Party to maintain and ensure total control. After all that was done, he began purging the government and urban societies of capitalists, political enemies, and anybody who might possibly stand in his way, also called class enemies. During this time, spouses turned on spouses, and children turned their own parents into the authorities. Events called struggle sessions were held, where people were publicly humiliated, beaten, tortured, even killed by those who were close to them. And by that, I mean their friends and family members. And if that wasn't bad enough, Mao declared that upper-class citizens shouldn't be publicly killed, but instead driven to suicide. In Shanghai, suicides became so common that people avoided walking on the sidewalks around tall buildings for fear of being crushed by people who were jumping to their deaths. Now, if you're like me, you're probably wondering how many people have been killed at this point. I don't have the answer yet, but I am going to total it up at the end for you, so just be patient. From 1903 to 1958, Mao implemented something called the 5-year plan, which pushed for heavy and rapid industrialization. With Soviet assistance, the Chinese Communist government was able to build plants that were heavily involved in the production of steel, coal, and other major heavy industries and fabrications. And the 5-year plan was really successful, and very popular. In fact, it was so successful and popular that Mao immediately implemented something called the second 5-year plan, also known as the Great Leap Forward. Now, before we dive into the Great Leap Forward, let's really quickly review Marx's progression of economics. You see, Marx believed that most societies started out in a feudal system, progressed to a capitalist society where there was a lot of free market enterprise and little government involvement. According to Marx, after capitalism, you would progress onto a socialist economy where there is a fair amount of government control and wealth is being spread around and redistributed, sometimes in the form of social programs. From a socialist society, Marx believed you would progress into a communist society, the goal of which was to eradicate all class and inequality, as well as all government, and that everybody would work simply for the purpose of fulfilling their lives and helping each other out. Back in Mao's China, you have a ton of people who were still living rather feudally. They had to live off of the food that they grew. They didn't go to stores. And in much of rural China, this is still the case to this day. Mao looked at the progress of China and at its current state said, I know that we're still feudal out in rural China, but our urban centers have industrialized very rapidly. I think we can skip the entire progression and go straight for the communist utopia. Anybody who's put together IKEA furniture will tell you that skipping steps, especially a lot of steps, not a good idea. Now, in order to industrialize at the rate required by the Great Leap Forward, Mao figured that we would need a lot of food and resources stored up. Essentially, this created a government stockpile in which the government could redistribute this grain anywhere it needed to. The idea being that by greatly increasing the grain production out in rural China, they could also industrialize that area at the same time. And so Mao's government set quotas that the local commune leaders would need to meet for grain production. The idea was that the commune leaders would then report their harvest to the government, then the government would come and collect the portion that they were supposed to take. But this is where it gets really messed up. You see, the commune leaders were scared to death of not being seen as a loyal communist, because anybody not seen as a loyal communist was the victim of a struggle session, sent to the Lao Gai, or just straight up publicly executed. So out of fear of their own lives, and not wanting to be seen as a disloyal communist, these commune leaders grossly overreported their harvest. The second problem was the government collected based on the reports, not based on the actual harvest. This meant that farmers and people living out in these rural communities were left with less grain than they needed to survive. Farmers began to starve. Because they starved, they began to die. Because they died, production numbers went down. But instead of saying, hey, our production numbers are down because we're all starving to death out here, those commune leaders, still not wanting to be seen as disloyal, just said, oh, the weather. There's some weird weather stuff going on. That's why production numbers are down. Which also meant the government took little to no action. The commune leaders could have just said, hey, you know that stockpile of grain you've got in case people out here starved? We're starving. People got so desperate they had to resort to cannibalism. Jasper Becker wrote that cannibalism in China happened on a scale unprecedented in the history of the 20th century. This is where our story about the war on sparrows comes in. You see, the commune leaders didn't just blame the drop in production on the weather, they also blamed it on the Eurasian tree sparrow, as well as mosquitoes, flies, and rats. And so an event we call the Four Pests campaign, citizens were asked to kill any and all mosquitoes, flies, rats, and Eurasian tree sparrows they could find. There was a particular emphasis on the eradication of the Eurasian tree sparrow due to a claim that they could eat up to 4 kilograms of grain per sparrow per year. These birds' nests were destroyed, their chicks were killed, and they were often trapped or even shot out of the sky. At one point, the Polish embassy refused to let Chinese government personnel to come in and clear the grounds of these sparrows. In retaliation to the Polish embassy's refusal to let Chinese personnel onto their grounds, they instead surrounded the embassy with drums, which they played really loudly. All this noise scared the sparrows out of their perches and nests and caused them to fly around until they were so exhausted they fell out of the sky dead. The number of sparrows that died as a result of this was so large that the embassy had to use shovels to remove them from the grounds. Now, because the Chinese government had eradicated all of the sparrows, there were no natural predators for locusts. And these locusts ate way more grain than the sparrows did. These locusts ruined entire harvests of grain and made the famine much worse. As a result, the Chinese government in 1960 reversed their position and ended up importing hundreds of thousands of sparrows from the Soviet Union to try and restore some amount of ecological balance. The amount of people who died as a result of this famine is anywhere from 15 to 55 million, which makes it either the second largest or the largest famine in all of human history. And here's the kicker. It could have been stopped at any time if the government had just released that stockpile of food to be used. I cannot stress this enough. 15 to 55 million people died of starvation while there was enough food to feed almost all of them in giant stockpiles held by the government, already dispersed all over Chinese territory. The famine could have been stopped at any given time. To his credit, Mao was largely kept unaware of the conditions people were facing. Doctors weren't allowed to list starvation as a cause of death, and anytime Mao would visit a commune, the leaders of that local community would go so far as to fake entire harvests just for show. That being said, if the commune leaders had been honest with Mao and not faked their harvests, it's highly likely they would have been sent to Laogai or publicly executed, and other people would have been punished just as well. In addition to all of the deaths from the Great Famine, the Great Leap Forward's policies resulted in another 2.5 million people who were either tortured or beaten to death. And anywhere from 1.5 to 3 million more people died of suicide. Most of these people suffered or were killed because they tried to stand up and because they tried to report the real numbers, or just because they were otherwise trying to help their friends and family. And due to policies surrounding how the communes were set up, people were banned from growing food privately. If you were found growing your own food, you were severely punished. Eventually everything did come out, and the very few lucky commune leaders who were allowed to survive the Laogai or public executions were simply removed from power and forbidden from holding office anymore. Now, if you add all of these deaths together and you account for the range of people who died in the Great Famine, your total is going to be at a bare minimum 24.3 million people and a maximum of around 73 million people who died or were murdered as a direct result of Mao and his Communist Party's policies. To put that in perspective, 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. As many as 50 million people died in World War II, worldwide, including civilians. The bubonic plague killed around 25 million people in Europe. And as of 2021, the entire population of California was close to 39 million. Again, the death toll of Mao's policies in these early years of Chinese communism is anywhere from 24.3 million to 73 million people. All of these deaths were the result of negligence or outright murder of their own citizens. After the failure of the Great Leap Forward, in 1959, Mao ceded much of his control over to other party members who were much less radical. He sort of sat in the background, advising and helping to make decisions, but not really holding any political power himself. And even then, he never accepted fault for the Great Famine or the failures of the Great Leap Forward. To his dying day, Mao maintained that the failure of the Great Leap Forward was due to rightist conspirators, political opponents, and disloyal communists. With the power of the government in the hand of less radical communists, the overall situation in China began to improve pretty quickly. And that progress lasted until 1966, when Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. If you've made it this far into the video, thanks again for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Check out my website, mrstockford.com, where I'm posting tons more informational articles and lesson plans. And also follow me on TikTok, where I post a lot of funny, historical, and teacher-related skits. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as John Green always says, don't forget to be awesome. I don't want to steal his trademark. Can I do that? It's a great trademark, though. Whatever, I'm gonna do it. He lives in Indianapolis. Maybe I'll just knock on his door and ask. I think he'll say no. He'll probably say no right after he says, "Who are you and what are you doing here?"